So good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's GlobalNet 21 webinar. And tonight we have Kate Faragher talking about how we learn from preschool play to boardroom innovation. I would say that many people feel that education is a bit of a mess today. And just in today's Guardian, I found, first of all, a comment piece by Polly Toynbee, and she was talking about the problems and the dire state of vocational and further education in this country. I turned over a page and I found 4 letters about how dysfunctional university education is. And then I turned to the main news section and found an article about how several grammar schools had just each been given over £3 million at the same time as funding per pupil has really gone down. So I think there's a general consensus that things are in a bit of a mess. And I believe that what we need to help get out of this mess is to listen to people who aren't actually in the system. We need to forget about the politicians and the people who are in the system, and we need to look to people with a broader view of human learning, learning outside the system, if you like. So Kate, I believe, has just this broader view. She's a collaborative communication consultant, so she facilitates discussions and communication. She's got a huge amount of very broad experience. She worked on the Today programme, Radio 4's BBC Radio 4's Today programme. She's worked at the National Theatre for various TV and film producing. And she's going to talk today about how we learn, but not, I think, from the narrow perspective of the school classroom, but from a much broader perspective. So I'm going to welcome Kate now and hand you over to Kate.
Brilliant. Terry, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm so delighted to actually be able to chat to a few of you today, because I've got quite a lot of questions. And I have questions because I am not a teacher in a school. I am not a professor in a university, but I am an educator. And I teach both in the political sector, in the financial sector, and I teach businesses and politicians how to look to the future. So we're constantly getting them to think more strategically, to do their jobs better. But what I constantly come up against is in the financial sector, people not being able to find those innovative, creative thinkers that they're looking for. And I believe that is to do with the way that the education is set up. So as a result of that, I now have set up, I now own a nursery, because I believe in the nursery sector we still are experimenting with self-managed learning and curiosity. And when we go into the primary school sector, it then starts to dissipate. And I'm really curious about why the early years sector is getting it so right, and yet it seems to diminish from that point onwards. So what I've been exploring for the last sort of 3-4 years is this whole idea of collaboration. In 2016, I did a TED talk about intuitive collaboration. And I called it intuitive collaboration. And what I meant by that was this moment where we are trying to find out how to shake things up a little bit, how to make it exciting. It's that moment where we come up with an idea. And that moment, I compared it to stigmergy in ants, because what ants do is that they, on their own, aren't considered that intelligent, but what they do, they build on the ideas of other ants to create a really complex structure, which is an ant colony. And I believe that unless we share ideas together in places like this and look at things in a much broader sense, we won't be able to work together to create the education and the learning systems, and indeed the other systems with regard to our planet in the future effectively. So for me, what intuitive collaboration was three things. It was about following your intuition. I used a story about when I worked at the National Theatre in the education department, when one of the actors I was working with on stage decided to do something completely against the grain, completely against what we had prepared, and he shook up the audience because they weren't listening. And the only way he got them to listen was to sort of grab their attention by breaking out of the rehearsal plan. And I think that it's the arts that truly teaches you to be brave in that moment and to trust yourself in that moment. And what I have done when I've worked all across the globe working with various people is that many people don't have the bravery to follow that intuition. And I believe it's based on the way that we are educated. For example, if you have somebody at the front of a classroom telling you what to do the whole time, you don't trust that inner voice of yourself of what interests you, and you don't follow it. So for me, learning how to follow your intuition is a key thing that we need to understand. And I want to, in this little 20 minutes to half an hour talk, is explore what I think it is and hopefully get some feedback from you guys about if you think I'm on the right track, or if you've got other concepts that we can discuss. The other thing that I notice in some other educators is the inability to read a room. As an actor, you learn an awful lot about how to read emotions in a room. It's kind of like that, feeling the force kind of idea. And when you read a room, it's about evaluating and reflecting how you did, and then constantly trying to improve it by deepening the level of connection. And I believe there's elements where you don't cognitively think I'm going to do something different, but you use your intuition, your body intuition, to know that you need to just react. And you get an awful lot of that from your own experience. Sorry, there's just somebody that's come in, so I don't know if it's a bit loud at the moment. But you have to trust your experience, and sometimes that's not cognitive. Sometimes that is truly intuitive. And if we are not teaching our children how to truly embrace that feeling, that trust of ourselves, then I think that we are missing out on people's intuitive intelligence. So if I can dig down into that a little bit more, because I think sometimes that can sound quite waffly. And actually, I think there's an awful lot of scientific basis to it, and there's an awful lot of understanding that we have in that. So if I can pose the question, what skills do we need to be an intuitive collaborator? I don't know what you guys do, but I know that I've been asking myself that question. How do I learn, and how do I be the facilitator that I am? And it was a Radio 4 interview with a guy called Joel Salinas that made me really question this. Joel Salinas has a synesthesia, which is called mirror touch synesthesia. And mirror touch synesthesia is when he's a doctor and he's a neuroscientist, and it's been proven that when he watches somebody else, he feels what they feel. They've looked at his brain, and it's shown that certain parts of his brain light up when he sees somebody in pain, and he feels the pain in pretty much the exact same place as that individual does. Quite tricky when you're a doctor. And then this really interesting, in his book called Mirror Touch, he talks about seeing somebody going through a cardiac arrest and seeing that person lose consciousness. And he goes through the feelings that he has in his own body when he sees that. So this synesthesia, mirror touch synesthesia, is an ability for us to really connect on a very deep level and how to understand each other. Now, I don't know whether I've got that, but I do know that I connect on that deeper level with people when I'm training in a room. I do know that I'm trying to understand how people are feeling by reading small things like their micro body language that they're showing to me. And that in that micro body language, some of which, to be honest, that is quite conscious, I can see how they might be listening or not listening, and how I need to change what I'm doing to re-engage their learning journey. So what that means is very simple things like when I'm at the front of the room, I will walk across the room and see whether the eyes are following me. If the eyes are following me, I know they're engaged. If they're not, then it means I try other techniques to see whether they are listening to me. Or it might be that I check their understanding by asking them questions just to see if they are engaged in what I'm talking about. I'm sure teachers use things like that all the time. But I believe that where Joel Salinas has got this quite unique synesthesia, where he is connecting at a very deep level, I believe we can learn that. And I believe it because I believe I've learned it. And I believe I've learned it through the skill of acting, which I did at Webber Douglas Academy. And I also did it through the National Theatre when I worked in the National Theatre, both in the education department and on the National Theatre stage. And I believe that when you really connect with people, you have to listen at a very deep level. You're not just listening for words, you're listening for body language. And I'll go into that in a little bit more depth in a second. So this is not, I don't think, just some whiffy waffle. I think that if we truly listen to children and to the people, to anybody that is learning, and I really don't think it is unique to children. I think the adults that I work with, I have to build up rapport and connection with them, usually in a few minutes. And I believe that deep listening really builds a comfort so people open up and truly are ready to learn. Because like a lot of people that I've spoken to, if you feel comfortable and you feel powerful and you feel listened to, you are more likely to be in a energetic state to learn and be open to learning. So I think this energetic, empathic connection is a way of deepening people's knowledge. And I also think it's a time when we truly know when to challenge people. Because, for example, my daughter's dyslexic. And that means that, we know from her assessment that she's had done, that she's extremely intelligent, but actually she finds writing and reading quite difficult. So rather than the teacher challenging her sometimes, the teacher she has now does actually, but previous teachers, they always worked at her reading and writing level or her maths level. They didn't work at her cognitive level. And I believe that's because they're not looking at it through the lens of learning or her self-interests, but looking at it through the education lens. Because I know that when I'm teaching adults, if they feel that they can get it wrong, then I can challenge them more. And if they feel that that I understand their position, they will deepen their conversation with me, and we can get to a more interesting place where you can work out where your learning, in a way, blind spot is. So I think this thing about mirror touch, this thing about empathy, is something that is part of an awful lot of some education theories. For example, the Brunner theory, which is about learners constructing new ideas based on past knowledge, which is quite straightforward. But I think teachers need to provide active support to increase the complexity of a topic. I think a lot of people really understand complexity a lot more than we give them credit for. And I think that empathy and slight nudging into new directions can help them do that. I think some of the challenges that we face is that because a lot of people need the context to truly understand it and try it out, it can be quite difficult. But I think we really need to think about how we are building in this empathic part of learning into all parts of the education system. And I'm not sure it can be that difficult. So my question to you guys is, how do we get that kind of empathy into schools? We have actually all the theories we need to show that this is the case, that we need to support people in order to learn. But how do we change that in schools? Is it just to do with the amount of work that teachers have, or is there something else out there? Terry, you've worked in education. What do you think?
Well, I think, Kate, that what you're saying about empathy and about Brunner's stages is absolutely spot on. But my worry is that the pressures that are put on everybody in the education system, really from primary school up to university, the pressure that's put on them to achieve certain outcomes means that it's very difficult for the people working, the teachers, the people working in the schools, to actually to take account of that, because they're obliged really to follow certain set syllabuses. They're obliged to concern themselves about what's perceived to be performance data. So it's very difficult, I think, for people to move beyond that. I don't want to be negative, because I think they should be moving beyond it. What do you think, Kate? Am I being too
No, I think you're not being critical enough, if I'm honest, because I think the teachers that I speak to, they believe that they want to do all those things, and they do have to think about outcomes. But I think you can deepen the outcome if you're listening at this level. And I think that you can, I don't know about, I've not been a teacher, but I know when I'm in a room and you've got multiple things going on, you're having to speak at different levels to different people. But if you've got people engaged on one level, then they can then teach other people and have that peer learning. And I think that teachers have to do too much at the front. So much learning happens in the small groups. So much learning happens in a different way. And I'm just not sure that the classroom situation or the way that classrooms are set up are the best way. For example, the research that we know about, we know that we learn more if we change how we sit, like where we sit, and yet we have our kids sitting in the same desk for the same amount of time all day. Yes, sometimes they go out on trips, but I know that if we learn something in one room and then we go to another room and learn it there, it embeds that learning even more. We also know that, for example, my daughter has to learn her spelling one week and then she learns new spelling the next week. We also know that we embed longer term memories if we let children forget about things. And quite often they're concentrating so much on getting through the syllabus, getting through the outcomes, that they're not using the research that's out there, scientific research that suggests actually sometimes you've got to let the kids forget for a bit longer, right at the start when you're teaching it, and not just, to forget for the test, but to forget to embed so that you're starting to layer it. And in the early years sector, for example, you would always let a child direct themselves in their learning. And I think these outcomes are not necessarily helpful in creating innovative thinking. I think we need to work out different ways that the classroom is set up, that the environment is set up. And I think, I completely agree with what you're saying. Teachers are under so much stress. They often know what to do. We know the science of what we need to do, and yet it's just not getting done. And it's almost like that we need to sort of all join together to work out, right, what does good look like? What does this new education look like? Because we are not delivering what business needs. We are not delivering what policy needs. We're not delivering the outcomes that we need as a society. And it stems from the way that the classrooms are run, I believe. So I completely agree with you that they are under that pressure, but I think it needs a complete shake-up. And I think we need to visualise what that looks like. And I think that might mean changing what schools look like.
I'm very sympathetic to that idea of changing what schools look like and changing what the classroom looks like. And two little stories come into my mind, Kate. The first is when I was doing training adults, and actually these were adults who had been unemployed for some time, and I was working with them on a weekly basis. And what I used to do in week 3, I would completely change the room around through 90 degrees. So they'd all come in and they would all have to sit in a different place. Now that's a very minor change, but it was really interesting to see how it changed the dynamic in the room, how it actually upset some people where they couldn't just go and sit in the same chair. So I think that the learning environment, the actual physical environment, is very important. And another story which I heard recently, which absolutely horrifies me, is in a school where pupils will be punished if they take their gaze away from the teacher. And I find that rather distressing, and I think it's rather fascistic in a way, because as you've indicated earlier, people learn by interacting with each other. But we've had a suggestion from Peter Feltham, and he says a technique used by a good school that he's familiar with is to use some parents volunteering as helpers. So they select parents, or they get parents who are going to be empathetic to this approach. So it unloads, Peter says it unloads some of the strain from the teacher, but I would also suggest that it actually takes away some of the focus from the teacher, and that actually is a good thing. I wonder if you'd like to comment on any of those ideas, really, in terms of the classroom.
I think it's great to bring parents in, but I think it's how they're brought in. Because I think sometimes what can happen is that, in the school that my daughter goes to, I was brought in, did a bit of reading, and it's kind of like quite patronising. It's kind of like, oh, you just come in and you just sit over there and do a little bit of help. Oh, we really appreciate you. But I think there's an awful lot more than parents can bring as members of our community and members of society. So I think it's a great idea, and I completely agree with Peter. But I think there might be other things, other ways that we can bring expertise into a room that's not just using, how can I say, in a way, using the parent in a way that the school wants you to, rather than engaging in a conversation with you, engaging in a dialogue with you. I don't know if you know what I mean, but that there's more that parents can bring, rather than just having some but building a sort of deeper connection with them as a part of the community, and understanding what they do a little bit maybe. There's certainly loads of parents in my daughter's school that I'd love to hear from what they've got to say about certain parts of their life, and not just about coming in and talking about their career, but helping to build a dialogue of different points of view, which is done a little bit, but I think it could be done and more embedded. But I'd like to pick up with that idea that you talked about with regards to punishment. I've heard so many, it's very terrifying stories about, kids that are being punished for things like speaking, or this thing that I see in some primary schools of kids being made to sit on their hands. And my understanding is that when you sit in your hands, you're stopping yourself from speaking. And also, I believe that you stop a little bit of your brain working. And I just find it really curious that, and also this inability to let boys be more, or boys or kinesthetic learners to be much more proactive. Now, I know that there's a lot of discussion about whether there is this thing about a kinesthetic learner, a visual learner, or a auditory learner. I think we are all of them, and I think we need to be much more mobile in when we learn. I certainly learn an awful lot when I move about. I come up with ideas when I move about. So if this idea of punishing people when they are doing something different, I would argue possibly innovative or something intuitive in themselves, then we are preventing them from exploring ideas sometimes. And there's just not enough movement, I think, in schools, and I feel quite sad about it. If you look at the early years system, which I find quite fascinating, that in early years, a 2-year-old doesn't know how to express themselves, much less than a 5 to 11-year-old. So when you're dealing with a 2-year-old, and I saw this in action the other day, a 2-year-old can have a tantrum because they don't know how to express what they're feeling inside. In a school, if somebody is having a tantrum, quite often they are punished, or they're taken out of the classroom, or action is taken as a result. But in an early years setting, what they do is they listen to the child. They try to uncover what's happening. They find solutions for what is maybe troubling them. They deepen the dialogue with the child to try to help them express how they're feeling. And I believe we need to teach expression. I think we need to teach dialogue. I think we need to teach a way to truly understand how to express what we feel, because certainly in an awful lot of the places I work, where I'm working with adults, we're not taught how to truly express how we think and how we feel. And I think more needs to be done. I'll give you another example. For example, I do a lot of work in Africa. And when I go to Africa, when I am at the front of a room, I have felt that some people are waiting for me to give them a bit of enlightenment, that because I am at the front and I'm the teacher. If I try to turn it around and say to them, you know more about certain things than I do, I'd like to hear from you. Some people push it back and say, no, you are the expert, you tell us. And I think we need to get to a place where we have this ability to, yes, listen and learn, but also we have this ability to be able to express what we're thinking in a more structured fashion. To in a way have mental discipline about how we speak. And I think that we don't teach mental discipline in how we speak and how we write. For example, I was delivering a writing course today, and I had academics, I had, researchers, I had amazing minds in the room, and yet so many of them found it difficult to communicate their complex messages in a simple way. And I just think that there's so many simple techniques that are out there that we're spending so much time thinking, what's an adverbial, preposition, or, when actually we just need to learn how to communicate with each other without being able to, and this is what I'm talking about, this thing about understanding things and being able to do things well without knowing what they're called. We need to experience stuff to learn. I know that I'm biased because that's how I learn, but I think this whole thing about the way that policy is often made is by government and parliament trusting scientific research. And I think sometimes there is other actual research. We need to listen to the teachers about what we need to do. We need to listen to people on the ground about what we need to do. And we need to collectively come together, not just in this siloed way, which I find quite frustrating because I'm not a teacher, but I'm interested in education. Quite often there's no in to have that discussion, apart from places like this. But where academia came up with... If I can just come in
there, Kate, to pick up on a few of the very good points you've made. First of all, I want to tell you my own story about the adverbials, because children now, I think as young as 9, are meant to know what a fronted adverbial is, and I don't know what that is. And I was having a conversation with a neighbour about this. What we men are like, we talk over the back garden fence. And he said, I'm a journalist. He said, and I don't really even know what a pronoun is, to be honest. Now, I think he might have been exaggerating, but here's somebody who makes his living freelance writing, and he was being very critical of the way his daughter was being taught English in school. And I think, that really quite concerned me, that the children are being taught in that way. I'd also like to pick up on what you said, I think partly about your experience in Africa, because that points to me to a cultural thing about being in a classroom. And I think sometimes if people, and I'm thinking about adults now, if they go back into a classroom, and I wonder if you'll agree with me here, some of them can go back towards the expectation that they had of the classroom when they were children. And when I was involved in training adults, mostly in the use of technology for learning, one of the techniques I used to like to do was to give them lots of ideas lots of tools. So we might spend the morning introducing them to various tools. And then I'd say, right, now produce something using these tools. You know, you might create a video and put some music to it.
Yeah.
And quite a lot of people just loved that.
Yeah.
But there were other people who really couldn't cope. And they wanted to say, well, I've come on a training day, you know, you tell me something or tell me what to do. And you see, that this, to come back to the title of tonight's webinar, I mean, you've already told us, I think, how we can apply preschool play to learning in schools, and how we can apply the techniques and the approaches that are used there in the school. But I wonder if we go to the other extreme, because the other part of your title was Boardroom Innovation. And I wonder if you can say anything about how you think your experience of working with people at that level, what we might call a high level, although I don't like the word high here, but at that level, what we can learn from how they work and how those people learn, and apply that to a more formal educational setting like schools. Okay, so I don't think we're taught how to think creatively, and I think it is a technique, just like a maths class, in how to the discipline of thinking. And in the boardroom, what I find is that a lot of people who have got to where they are have got there by working hard and being able to influence those around them and following a format. Because up to this point in society, quite often it's following a format, or following the rules of the manager, following the instructions of the manager. Having a very strong leader is the way that they have got on in their business. So they get on in the business by doing what they're told, by coming up with a few kind of ways of saving money, and then progressing. But actually, businesses need something completely new now. Businesses need people to think innovatively, to think collaboratively. And yet, sometimes at the moment, it's in the business's interest for the sales team to collaborate more effectively with the marketing team. But because culturally they've always been siloed, they find it very difficult to trust that. Why is that? There's a part of me that thinks that's because in education we get taught you're going to be tested, and you're not tested how to work as a group, you're tested how to work alone. So, how do we build in those collaborative skills? I believe there's an awful lot of things that we can learn. There's a really amazing book called The Toddler Brain, which was written by an MIT professor, which says that the brain of the toddler, which is constantly asking why, how, not ever what we call, converging it down to an answer, or the word that you used earlier, converging it down to an outcome, but being divergent in their thinking, constantly looking at ways to open up the idea and come up with new solutions that don't fit with the cultural context in the environment that they're working in. And I think what's happening in the boardroom is that the boardroom are asking artists, writers, comedians, different thinking strategists to come in to help them be more divergent in their thinking. And I think sometimes using playful things, I was in a financial company the other day, and I was using Play-Doh, and I was getting them to sort of think about using Play-Doh as the amount of time they had in a week, and then breaking it up into the different sections about how they're using their time. I then got them to get another bit of Play-Doh and break it up and say, how do you actually use their time, and to see the difference. Now, when you use things that are much more 3D, you're actually using a different part of your brain that I don't think we utilize that as much, which is a more spatial awareness part of your brain. And immediately everyone went, oh my God, I know exactly what I need to do. I need to stop doing that and start doing this. This playful way of looking at things from a different perspective is what's required. And quite often they don't have the skills to do it. The other thing, I've been brought in a number of occasions to help people run a meeting more effectively. And people don't know how to chair a meeting. People don't know often
and I looked at HBR the other day, the Harvard Business Review, and they've got all these books on how to run a meeting, how to manage difficult situations, how to get people to speak up. All these things are absolutely integral to our working and dynamic economy. And we're just not being given the skills how to do it, so that, graduates are coming to the workplace and not knowing how to chair a meeting. Graduates are coming not knowing how to give a succinct answer. So in the boardroom, I think, one of my colleagues would say by then it's too late. I disagree. I think there are still loads of ways that we can teach people to access their own creativity to come up with the solutions, rather than relying on the artists and to do it. And the only way that we will be able to enable that is by having more of the arts and the way that arts are taught within and embedded within the syllabus. And I know that I've got a funny feeling you might agree with me there, having worked in the music department. I don't know.
Well, certainly, Kate, I was very pleased to hear you use the word play there, because of course, we talk about, if you're a musician, playing is what you do. If you're an actor, you take part in a play. And I think it's no coincidence that we use the word play for what children do, but we also use the word play for two very important things that adults do, which is to make music and to perform on the stage. Yeah. The other thing I would pick up on what you said is when you talked about... do respond to that, please.
I was just going to say that I believe that moment of playfulness, which is also improvisation, is exactly what I'm talking about. It's the same energetic, intuitive moment, intuitive collaboration or energetic empathy that happens that we need to learn. And I don't think it is this wishy-washy thing. I think it's an actual thing that we can learn how to improve upon. And I think it's built into play. Sorry to just pick up on that.
No, I think, I agree with all that. And it's really, I'm really pleased to hear you say that. The other thing I wanted to pick on was the idea of the silos, of people working in silos. Because I think that it's not just that the exam system is a sort of silo because it forces you to a very narrow focus, but I think the curriculum itself is very much in silos. You might study physics, or you might study chemistry, or you might study biology. But what fascinates me is that one of the greatest scientific discoveries of the middle of the 20th century was when Crick and Watson and others discovered DNA. And yet Crick at the time was doing a PhD in physics, and he stopped working on his PhD in physics to make what arguably was the most important discovery in biology. So if you ever look at where progress really happens, it's by people jumping out of the silos and making connections. And I think you do make connections if you're improvising or playing, but I fear that both because of the subject-based nature of the curriculum and the exam-based nature of the curriculum, we don't encourage those connections, and then maybe that goes into the world of work where people say, well, my job is HR, or my job is finance, rather than looking at the bigger picture.
I agree.
Any comments on that?
And if I go back to what you were talking about, the Polly Toynbee articles today and the different articles that you saw in the newspaper, I think that what I find frustrating is that quite often there isn't a place to have that collaborative discussion. So I'm doing my own qualification. It's called a WikiQual, which is a way to develop my own learning style. I don't want to go to university to do it because I'm very specific about what I want to learn. But it's deeply frustrating because if we look at some of the things that I've talked about early years, I've talked about learning, self-managed learning through a WikiQual. I've talked about dance, the importance of how dancing and learning is important. I've talked about empathy. I've talked about neuroscience. I've talked about how we learn, how we forget, how we remember. And actually all of these are within different different areas, and I believe that they are all connected with this one thing. And yet, how do I pull that together? I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but I do believe that it is through lots of different parts that I will come up with the answer of what this is. And I think it is only through the spinning of lots of different ideas across lots of different places that we do innovate. For example, when I did go to Africa and then I came back here, I saw our system in a much more different way because I'd seen it slightly differently in a different country, or the way that I see for example, if I work in one sector, if I work in the Welsh Assembly, then what you find is that the way that the Welsh Assembly works versus the way that the House of Commons works is completely different because they are different legislature, they have different sizes, and also if you look at the way that Sri Lanka governs and versus the way that Wales governs versus the way that America governs, it's all different because of this, or Iceland. Everybody has got something that they do slightly differently, even though the structures are the same. And so if you dip from one thing to another, there's just best practice, and and if you dip in with curiosity, there are just so many things that you can learn. And I don't know how we build those cross-cultural ideas, because it's complicated. I mean, as we found tonight, how do you dig in deeply into all these different areas to build understanding of them? I think it's really difficult, but I think we've got to find a way, because that's where the answers are going to lie.
Yeah, and it's interesting there, Kate, that you said you don't have all the answers, but I think at this stage, the important thing is to have the questions, and you're asking the right questions. And we're drawing to an end now, but I've got a comment here, another comment from Peter, which I think is actually rather an optimistic note, perhaps, on which to end. So I'll ask you to respond to this. Peter says that graduates, and indeed all the younger generation, he says, can bring in tremendous skills in terms of communicating better. And they can bring in the ability to multitask. And as we come to the end of this first webinar that I've done, I'm very aware of my inability to multitask. So I need help on webinar multitasking for the younger generation, I think. And perhaps more importantly, he says they also bring in digital worlds skills. So he suggests that in time, might break the tired management methods. So I think it's important what he said, because he's putting a more optimistic note into something where I tend to be sometimes very pessimistic about what schools are encouraging young people to do. But he's saying, that they're doing well. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that finally, Kate.
Well, I think that children are immensely resourceful, and I think I think it will change, and I agree with Peter. I'm a bit optimistic, and I do think that they will push for the change that's required. But for me, that's too long. I want it to be quicker than that. I'm too impatient. I think there are ways. What I find frustrating but exciting is that we do have an awful lot of the answers. We have so many of them. A lot of teacher training, a few of my friends have gone through it. A lot of them are taught all these things. It's possible. So my big question is, how do we enable what we already know to happen? And I think that can only come if a few of us come together and really kind of almost paint out, vision board what that future could look like. And what I'm really excited about is that there's an awful lot of people that are doing that. There's an awful lot of people that are setting up their own schools, that are setting up their own ways of doing it, that are exploring what works and piloting new ideas. We're doing our own piloting system, and I know that loads of other people are. And the more we pilot, the more we understand, the more we will have evidence to hopefully push the system into a way that it will become what we need as a society, and our wonderful children will come up with the answers that we need to innovate for a more exciting future. So I am optimistic, but I think that we need a lot of us still to push, nudge, and to constantly challenge the data so that we can prove that this is the best way forward.
Well, that's a nice optimistic note on which to finish. So thanks very much indeed, Kate, for sharing thank you for sharing your ideas with us. Thank you everybody for attending this webinar, and I'm certainly leaving feeling more optimistic than I did at the start.